Well, thank you all for coming. The name of this presentation, as you can see here, is Unmasking Evolution, What Your Biology Textbook Forgot to Tell You. Now, how many of you know the expression, I'm sure you do, that there are two sides to every story? Of course, everyone knows that, right? But my dad used to tell me this. He said, son, there are three sides to every story: your side, my side, and the facts. And so now we find out that even facts aren't always factual. And now we even have fact checkers, and even sometimes they seem to get it wrong. So I love science. It's a noble pursuit to understand how things work and how to make something better. We wouldn't have a smartphone in your pocket without science. But science has limitations, especially regarding the past. This presentation is about presenting the other side of the story. So, the question of origins, which is a question of how did we get here? It's a story that determines your worldview, your view of God, and your view of Scripture. And there are multiple viewpoints on origins. For instance, among evolutionists, you have Darwinists, which are pure gradualism. There's not many in that camp anymore. Most have moved to become what's called neo-Darwinists, which is gradualism and modern genetics. And then there's punctuated equilibrium, which was popularized by the late Stephen Jay Gould, who was a paleontologist at Harvard, and we'll talk about him in a minute. And then among the creationists, you have young Earth, old Earth, gap theorists, and theistic evolution. And I kind of like what this kid says. You know, sometimes you need to change your point of view. So there are only three religious questions. The first question is, how do we get here? That's a question of origins. And the second question is, why are we here? Which is a question of purpose. And then the third question is, where are we going? Which is a question of destiny. So are we created in the image and likeness of God, or are we simply a cosmic accident, the result of several perfectly timed accidents of chance? There's a big difference, and it directly impacts the question of purpose. If we're just an accident, then there can be no purpose other than just survival. Is our destiny just a grave with a headstone, or is there life beyond this life as promised? How we answer the first question directly impacts the other questions. So Darwin attempted to answer the question of origins, but origins was always a question for religion. But Darwin tried to answer it from science, and ever since there's been this great chasm that has existed between the church versus science. But here's what we really need to know, is what questions can science truly answer? What questions remain matters of faith? Now, for Christians, creation is a big deal. You know, all through Scripture, from Genesis to Revelation, God is honored as the creator. And here's a verse from the last chapter of the book, from Revelation. It says, "You are worthy, our Lord and God, to receive glory and honor and power, for you created all things, and by your will they were created and have their being." And so when you look at origins, according to science, however, is that according to science, origins is rooted in the materialist worldview. And this is the view that governs all your high school and college textbooks. It's based on the same premise, that since God cannot be seen, there is no God, or at a minimum, he cannot be considered. Life and existence must be explained only by natural processes, also known as naturalism. Now, this is a view that nothing exists except chemicals and matter. Even our sense of consciousness is nothing more than chemical interactions and electrical impulses in the brain. There is no soul that is separate from our bodies, according to the materialist worldview. Now, when you look at the grand plan from bacteria all the way to man, the creation story, it is a creation story that leaves God out of the equation. Every religion must answer the question of origins. Evolution is the creation story of atheism. I mean, think about it. I don't know any atheists who believe in a creator. Now, strangely enough, I do know some Christians who believe in evolution. But the primary driver, the organizing concept, if you will, is that random mutations occurred in the genetic code. Natural selection preserved those beneficial mutations. Gradual changes in the organism led to a new species. It's a process that is repeated billions of times, leading ultimately to you and to me. Now, the key principle is this: random chance and natural selection, which are by definition unguided, undirected, with no plan and no purpose. Because as soon as you invoke a plan or a purpose, you invoke intelligence, and it is no longer random. Now, all life forms exhibit three key attributes: complexity, order, and design. Now, you can see this machine. It exhibits all three. Why? Because it is the result of human intelligence. Yet we're to believe that similar structures in nature are the result of nothing more than an unguided, random process. Now, let's look at complexity. When you look at just the complexity of a single cell, it's astonishing how complex it is. In fact, it's irreducibly complex, meaning that if one component is missing, it would cease to function. And so it begs the question of how did it evolve by small mutations if everything has to be in place for it to work? And then there's the question of order, which are natural physical laws. Everything operates within a prescribed order. I like this little cartoon of the science teacher. You know, why science teachers should not be given playground duty. He's demonstrating Newton's law here, that for every action there is a reaction. And, you know, everyone who's married knows this law very, very well. So when you don't take out the garbage at night, guys, you know you get a reaction. But there are natural laws, such as laws of motion and momentum, laws of energy and mass, laws of thermodynamics, and more. And then here's a pesky law that evolutionists don't like to talk about, the law of biogenesis, which says this: that living things come from only from other living things by reproduction. Life does not arise from non-living matter or material. In other words, we've never observed this in nature, and we've never seen it happen in a laboratory, but many evolutionists don't like to call this a law because they still hang on to the hope that they'll prove somehow that life emerged from non-living matter billions of years ago. But since it's never been observed in nature or in a lab, it's probably safe to call it a law. And then there is design, from the simple to the complex, from a pencil to a chair to an iPad. We intuitively know that they were designed, engineered, and manufactured to be what they are. We see the clear evidence of intelligence. In fact, there's a whole school of thought within the larger creation movement called ID, which says that behind the design is the designer. Imagine that. It is seen as evidence for God's involvement in his creation. And here's a great verse of scripture from Romans 1. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. Now, I like to use this example. I can be in the house, and I can see the trees move, and I know that it's windy. I see the effect of the wind, even though I can't see the wind itself. You see, Paul is telling us that all of creation is the effect. Well, what's the cause? Paul would tell you it's God himself. But we're taught to believe that it is a result of an unguided, random process. Big difference. Now, the evolutionists can't quite handle this, so it's really only considered apparent. It may look like a design, but it's really not. And so, in other words, it may look like a duck, it may quack like a duck, it may walk like a duck, but it's really just an illusion. So, in other words, you have Richard Dawkins, the famous biologist, atheist, and goes on the campus lecture circuit, written a dozen books or something. He says this: biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. Oh, it couldn't be actually that way. No. It's just an illusion. Well, you see, now it's interesting that anytime you say evolution is just a theory, evolutionists get very indignant. And they say evolution is more than a theory, it's a fact. Now, you see, here's the problem. This is kind of a sleight of hand, because when you and I think of evolution, or at least when I do, I'm thinking of the grand plan from amoeba to man. But that's not what the evolutionist is saying here. He is saying this: that's simply stating that species change over time. And from that definition, they're right. Evolution is a fact because species do change over time. Now, and here are the common proof points, is that bacteria become resistant to drugs. Insects, they become resistant to pesticides. See, it changed. Proof, voila, evolution. But you see, every creationist agrees with the principles of adaptation and microevolution. But however, we believe that there are limits to evolutionary change. We believe that organisms vary within a specified range as determined by the DNA. What creationists would object to is the notion that evolution has occurred on the grand macro level of one class of animals morphing into another through random mutations, like a reptile morphing into a mammal. Now, speciation, as I said, does occur. Now, speciation occurs most often when the genes of one population of animals differs enough from other populations of its species that they cannot interbreed and produce viable offspring. So in other words, this occurs mostly through geographic isolation. A portion of a population gets separated, and over time, the limited gene pool creates a new species. So for instance, here are 4 species of the killer whale. Now, since we're talking about whales, let's look at the evolution of the whale for a minute. So the evolutionists will say that similarities in the skeletal structure are considered proof that the whale evolved from either the wolf or the bison or the hippo. It varies based on the textbook you're reading. So in other words, here's one where we see the whale evolving from a wolf-like creature called a Masonichid that's now extinct. It apparently lived in Asia at some point in time. And then here's another one where we see that the whale evolved from the hippopotamus. And now how do they come up with this notion? It's called homologous structures. And what they do is that they compare the wing of a bird, the wing of a bat, the arm of a human, the leg of a lion, a horse, and a frog, and the fin of a whale, and they say, gee, don't they look similar? That must be proof that they evolved from a common ancestor. Now, here's the question you're not allowed to ask. Teacher, is it possible that they're similar because of a common design? Oh, no. You can't ask that question because, you see, the answer would be outside the constraints of the materialist view. So even though it may be true, we're not allowed to consider it. You know, that's interesting, is I thought science followed the evidence wherever it leads, but not when it comes to origins. You see, there's a reason why the Ford looks similar to the Chevy, because they're built on a common platform, a similar design. There's a reason why blueprints of a building, buildings in a city or houses in a subdivision, even though they're built by different builders and designed by various architects, yet they all look similar. Why? Because they're based on a common platform or a design. Now, the evolutionists will point to genetic similarity as proof. So they'll say that the DNA of a rabbit is 85% the same as a man. But then the DNA of an ape or a monkey is 98% the same. And so they look at this trajectory and they say, gee, you know, that must be proof of evolution. But you see, I see it as complete opposite. You see, because I would expect that the DNA of a primate would be similar to a man because we're so similar in nature. Now the evolutionists will say that this 2% variance is just a chip shot. It's just, I mean, that's easy to close that gap, you know, random chance and natural selection over the course of a couple million years, no problem. But what they don't tell you is that this 2% variance represents 66 million lines of genetic code. This is no chip shot. This is a gap as wide as the Grand Canyon. Here's a big question. Which came first, the chicken or the egg? Every organism is instructed by its DNA. The DNA is the blueprint for life. It determines everything about it. Even a single-celled organism must be instructed by its DNA, yet the DNA cannot exist outside the protection of the cell membrane. In fact, the DNA is in the nucleus of the cell for maximum safety. And so now we enter the realm of science fiction, because the evolutionists cannot explain how life evolved on Earth. Because the DNA must come first. It contains all the instructions for the cell. But it is impossible for the DNA to survive outside the protection of the cell. So now, So now they postulate that the first cells came from other planets on the back of comets and meteorites. Oh, I see. We can't explain how it evolved here, so it must have evolved there. Isn't that convenient? It's like, teacher, what class is this? Now let's talk about the scientific method, because this is always invoked. Now, what is the scientific method? You know, evolutionists will often say that their theory adheres to the scientific method. However, most of the so-called proof points of evolution are conjecture as to what happened in the past. Here's your scientific method. Observe something happening in the present, create a hypothesis, and make a prediction. You'll be able to conduct an experiment, and that experiment must be able to be replicated by somebody else. And that experiment either validates or falsifies your hypothesis. And so now I want to show you an amazing quote. This is by John Tchaikovsky, who writes in GeoTimes, and he says this: "Evolutionists have physics envy. They tell the public that the science of evolution is the same science that sent people to the moon and cures a disease. It's not. The science of evolution is not empirical, meaning observable, but forensic, meaning historical." He goes on, "Because evolution took place in history, its scientific investigations are after the fact. No testing, no observation, no repeatability, no falsification, nothing at all like physics. I think this is what the public perceives, that evolution is just a bunch of just-so stories disguised as legitimate science." Well, that's a powerful quote. Now, Darwin's hypothesis was based somewhat on the scientific method in that he proposed that the fossil record would bear his theory to be true. So he assumed that over the course of time, that thousands of variations or transitional fossil forms would eventually be found. And yet so few have been found that gradualism has been abandoned by many evolutionists. And here's a big problem for evolution, and it's called the Cambrian explosion, also known as evolution's Big Bang. In other words, animals with sophisticated body plans just suddenly appear in the fossil record. In fact, 21 of 28 known animal phyla, these are body plans, just suddenly appear with no evolutionary ancestors. Now, this allegedly happened about 500 million years ago. And all these creatures are exhibiting complexity, such as eyes, nervous system, legs, fins. And here are just some of the body plans that show up. You have vertebrates, such as fish, invertebrates, such as worms, exoskeletons, such as crabs, and mollusks, such as clams. And so this picture kind of explains all the different creatures that are here. And yet, these two charts are radically different. The chart on the top here shows is kind of classic Darwinian evolution, which everything evolving from a single common ancestor, and yet what the fossil record appears to show is really sudden appearance, which looks a lot more like creation than gradual evolution. And Stephen Jay Gould, a leading paleontologist at Harvard University, he exposes the weakness. He says this: "The extreme rarity of transitional forms in the fossil record persists as the trade secret of paleontology. The absence of fossil evidence for intermediary stages between major transitions, indeed our ability, even in our imagination, to construct functional intermediates in many cases has been a persistent and nagging problem for gradualistic accounts of evolution." I kind of doubt that is in your high school biology textbook. So, has the hypothesis been falsified? Not a chance. Instead, Gould postulates a new theory called punctuated equilibrium, saying that everything was going along fine in a state of equilibrium, nothing changing, when all of a sudden there was some cosmic event that caused a rapid-fire number of mutations, and it happened in different geographic areas all around the world, but it happened so fast it had no chance to leave a fossil trail. Well, isn't that convenient? So now there's no way to falsify his hypothesis, is there? Now here's the latest research. This is really interesting. Massive study of over 5 million gene snapshots called DNA barcodes across 100,000 species. You had biologists all around the world were submitting data into a database over the course of 5 years. And they determined that 90% of all species came into existence over the past 100 to 200,000 years. That's far from gradual evolution over millions of years. And then it goes on and says that the common evolutionary view is that species will become more genetically diverse over time through mutation and natural selection, but the reality is that genetic diversity has been about the same over the entire period. Another unexpected finding is this, that species have very clear genetic boundaries, no real evidence of in-between species. This is exactly what creationists have been saying all along. Now let's look at mutation and natural selection. So in other words, we have these, they've done thousands of experiments on fruit flies, because you can get a new generation of fruit flies every 3 or 4 days. So they bombarded these fruit flies with all kinds of like radiation and chemicals to try to force a mutation. And then no change has occurred that has become a benefit to the species. In one instance, there was a fruit fly that had developed a second set of wings, but the wings weren't connected to anything. They just hung on the body and didn't flap. And so they ended up being a limitation and not an advantage to the species. So then about 30 years ago, we shifted from fruit flies to experimenting with bacteria, because you can get a new generation of bacteria about every 10 minutes. And so now it's interesting that proteins are what compose all living organisms. And they're called biological engines. Proteins do all the work. Now, each protein is composed of 20 specific amino acids in different combinations. So each protein will have the same number of amino acids, those 20 amino acids, but in different combinations based on the protein. And now what's interesting is that bacteria are also composed of proteins. Now, we've observed thousands of generations of bacteria. We have never observed the development of a new functional protein. Now, this is a big deal. If we were to observe evolution happening, it would happen right here with the development of new functional proteins. In other words, if one species is supposed to morph into another, it would require the development of thousands of new proteins. Yet we cannot observe the process that is required for it to happen. I think that's a big deal if you're going to call it science. And then there's this, the missing link. There's not the missing link. There's billions of missing links. If you're talking about going from the first cell to the first fish to the first amphibian to the first reptile to the first mammal all the way to man, there are billions of missing links. Now, this is a key understanding right here, is that random mutations do not create new genetic information leading to increasing complexity. We've never observed it, either with fruit flies or bacteria. In fact, each one of these, what evolution would demand that the series of mutations be a gain of function mutation, because obviously you're becoming more complex, more genetic information is required as you go up that food chain, from the single cell to the fish to the amphibian. Each would require not just random mutations, but gain of function mutations, and they just don't happen. In fact, the vast majority of mutations are either insignificant or dangerous. Natural selection, as it's always talked about, simply preserves the genetic integrity of the organism. It is not a creative force. Let's just narrow this sequence down to, in other words, can you explain how a reptile evolved into a mammal? Now look at the changes that are required here. Cold-blooded to warm-blooded. A complete transformation in the entire metabolism? Are you kidding me? From scales to fur, from egg laying to live bearing, from egg nutrients to mammary glands, a 3-chambered heart to 4, a multiple bone jaw to a single bone jaw. I mean, what caused all these transitions anyways? I mean, both reptiles and mammals exist right now. It's not like the reptile had to morph into a mammal in order to survive. They both exist right now. You see, no one has ever demonstrated a credible evolutionary sequence of the reptile evolving into a mammal. But this is what we're supposed to believe. And then there's the problem of reproduction. Now, there are a few exceptions to the rule, but in most cases, it takes two to tango. So, in other words, in order for a new genetic trait to be transferred to the next generation, there must be two organisms, male and female, at the same time and at the same place, with the same genetic mutation. They must get romantic. Only then does it become a dominant gene transferred to the following generations. Now, would anyone like to calculate the statistical probabilities of this actually happening on a grand scale? I mean, you can understand what might happen once in a while, but let's just look at mammals, for instance. I mean, the first mammal was said to be like a rat. It's called an insectivore. It's basically a rat that ate bugs. So from the first rat evolved the bear, the giraffe, the lion, the elk, the wolf, from ape all the way to man. Now, can you imagine all of the perfectly timed accidents of chance that are required for this scenario to occur? And then let's add to this fish, birds, insects, plants. How many more trillions of perfectly timed accidents of chance are required? Now, plants is what blows my mind. Now, evolution says that all land plants evolved from algae. That's right. The oak tree, this right here, evolved from seaweed. The oak tree evolved from that. Now, I don't know about you, but I have a hard time getting my head around that. Now the problem is that there are 400,000 flowering plants on Earth. 2,000 are edible from man. So you go to a farmer's market or go to Kroger's grocery, go to the produce section. Is it conceivable to believe that apples and peaches and pears and squash and tomatoes and pineapples and bananas and potatoes and corn and wheat and so much more all evolved by accident? Plants just happened to provide food for the entire animal kingdom, but it was just an evolutionary coincidence. Now, Dr. Everett Olson, who is the chair of biology at UCLA, he says this: supposedly somewhere within a group called algae lay the sources of the higher plants. Whatever these ancestors may have been, they seem to have been irrevocably lost in the vastness of time. So in other words, there's really no evidence to prove that the oak tree evolved from seaweed. It's essentially a statement of faith. Now, I kind of agree with this bird right here. You've got to be kidding me. All with no plan and no purpose? This is what you and I and your children are supposed to believe, that the extreme variety of organisms, all exhibiting complexity, order, and design, occurred through a random process with no guidance, no direction, no plan, and no purpose. Well, you know, many of these learned academics who grace the halls of our institutions of higher learning often shower mockery and ridicule upon any student who even whispers that they believe in God or creation. They're puffed up in their delusion of intellectual superiority. Paul has something to say about them, and right here in Romans 1, he says, professing themselves to be wise, they became fools. And what is the fool? It tells you in the Psalms. The fool has said in his heart, there is no God. And he also says this, ever learning and never coming to a knowledge of the truth. You know, there's only one word in my vocabulary that fits this scenario that we're supposed to believe, and that word is preposterous. You see, as the saying goes, I was born at night, but I wasn't born last night. And so I know what you're selling, but I ain't buying. Now let's talk about purpose, the key of creation. Now, everything exists on purpose. If you look around this room at everything, you know, the stage, this podium, the chairs, the fabric on the chairs, the carpet, the paint, the lights, the clothing you're wearing, the shoes on your feet, the pen in your pocket, everything here exists on purpose. In fact, if there's a gum wrapper in here somewhere from someone who was here, you know, yesterday, it's not random. It exists because it wrapped a stick of gum to keep it fresh. It's not random. And the same thing goes for your home, your office, and your car. Now, the only thing that exists randomly in this room is dust. So now it's interesting, everything in this room was created to serve a purpose. We understand this intuitively. They were designed, engineered, and manufactured to perform a function. Now, without a purpose, it does not exist, from the simple to the complex. So, for instance, now I hope you all have a pencil, because I hope you all were handed a pencil. If you're not, you'll have to get one. It's the simplest thing you can find, right? I mean, only 5 basic materials. I mean, you have the wood, the paint, the graphite core, the metal band, and a piece of rubber at the end for an eraser. 5 basic ingredients. Now, yet we would never say that the pencil evolved by itself, or even that it could evolve by itself, right? But wait a minute. Now, what if we took all the raw materials, put them in a pile, put your wood, your paint, your graphite, your metal, and your rubber, put it in a pile and add 1,000,000 years, is it possible for it to come up with a pencil then? And the answer is no. But why is it no? Why is the answer no? Because the raw materials cannot determine their own purpose. Purpose is the direct result of intelligence. The pencil exists because man needed something to write with. So we invented it. We designed it, engineered it, and manufactured it to be exactly what it is. But here is the punchline. You see, neither can the individual cells within your body or the protein molecules that make your cells, they can't determine their purpose either. Who instructs them to become a kidney cell, which is different from a liver cell, which is different from a heart cell? They all serve different purposes. Now you can say that it's written in the DNA, but who wrote the DNA? Did the DNA instructions just write itself? You see, how is it possible that, I'm so taken with this pencil analogy that I even have a website called beholdthepencil.com. It's on your pencil, by the way. So how is it possible that we know intuitively that a pencil could never evolve through a random process, and yet we're supposed to believe that it's something as complex as we are evolved from an unguided random process? And if you add complexity to the equation, it just makes the whole concept that much more absurd. Obviously, if a pencil can't evolve by itself, as you know, it's obviously a smartphone could never happen. And so we kind of know this intuitively. But wait a minute, look at your hand. Everyone has 2 hands. Most of you do, anyways. Hold one of them out. Now, look at that hand right there. You had it all your life, and it has been unappreciated, I got to tell you, because there are 27 bones, 27 ligaments, 18 muscles, 40 tendons, 15 cartilage-coated knuckles, 400 blood vessels, a network of nerves with 7,200 nerve endings, all attached to a mainframe computer, which allows you to sense pressure, texture, heat, cold, to lift heavy objects, to perfine form motor movements, and like a surgeon. In fact, your hands are even used to communicate, especially if you're Italian. Now look at the eye. Even Darwin had a hard time thinking that the eye had developed by chance from a light-sensitive spot on the skin, like a freckle. Think of this. Complete with retina, pupil, cornea, optic nerve, iris, lens, tear ducts for moisture, muscles to turn. It's ludicrous to believe that something this complex evolved by chance. Now, the eye and the hand are easy because you can see your hands, I can see your eyes, and because we can see them. But what about other systems? Look at your digestive system. It's astonishingly complex. But let's look at all the systems in harmony. Circulatory system, skeletal system, respiratory system, and on, all working together in what's called systemic interdependence. In other words, all systems must be in place for the organism to survive. Which system can you do without? Which is exactly why the psalmist says in Psalm 139 that we are fearfully and wonderfully made. And if you don't believe that about yourself, then go home and look at your pets. Look at your dog and your cat. They're fearfully and wonderfully made too. You see, in our world, everything exists on purpose. Yet we're expected to believe that in nature, everything exists through randomness and chance. Now, why should the natural world be any different from our world? Take purpose out of the equation, and there's no reason for anything to exist. Now, think about it. The pencil exists because man willed it to exist. Man exists, we exist, because God willed us to exist. For what purpose? To be in relationship with him. God is a relational being. And the first step in that relationship is to acknowledge him as creator. Modern genetics and information technology. Bill Gates once said that DNA is like a computer program, but far more advanced than any software ever created. And I believe genetics is going to be the Achilles heel of evolution. Now, you know that computer code is based on ones and zeros, and our DNA code is based on 4 letters, A, T, C, and G, which are abbreviations for the 4 nitrogen-based nucleotides that form our DNA. Now, I want you to look at this. When you compare code complexity, Microsoft Office, which I'm using right now with PowerPoint, and of course it includes Word and Outlook and Excel and maybe some other stuff, uses about 50 million lines of code. Facebook uses about 75 million lines of code. Google and all the internet services that run on Google, about 2 billion lines of code. Your human genome, replicated in every single cell of your body, 3.3 billion lines of code, all by random chance. Let's look at the human genome for a minute. Now, the human genome was basically mapped in the year 2000, and they discovered that there are over 20,000 genes that are spread across our 23 base pairs of chromosomes. Now, each gene contains the instructions for making and functioning of one or more proteins. So now let's look at the complexity of just a single gene. Let's look at hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is what takes oxygen and nutrients to every cell in your body. In other words, so it is one of 1,500 genes on chromosome number 11. The RNA, which is messenger DNA, the RNA goes to the DNA library and extracts 1,600 letters of code that are needed. Now, interesting, I have no idea how they figured this out, but 444 of those DNA letters are instructions for how to make the hemoglobin, and the other 1,100 plus letters are the instructions for the functioning of the protein. In other words, how much to make, where it's supposed to go, what it's supposed to do when it gets there. And so it's astonishing that each gene is composed of specified information. Now, here's what we know from information technology, is that information is never random. Information is always the result of intelligence. In fact, when random things happen to your computer code, the programs don't work, and it's usually associated with a virus of some kind. So let's look at probability science for a minute. Now, as you know, I already mentioned this, proteins are composed of 20 specific amino acids, but there's about 300 or more amino acids that occur randomly in nature, but only 20 are used for us, for life, for living organisms. The simplest protein is a chain of about 100 amino acids, which is like insulin, which metabolizes sugar in the bloodstream, but it's in a very specific sequence. And so the statistical probability of the simplest protein forming by chance is 1 in 10 to the 164th power. I mean, it is absurdly remote, that it is virtually impossible. Now, don't confuse proteins with a cell. The simplest cell is composed of about 4,000 different proteins. Now, let's look at this example here, random chance and probability. So in other words, what I did, I took our alphabet and used 20 letters to represent the 20 different amino acids. Instead of 26 letters, I used 20 letters. And I constructed a paragraph using 102 letters in a specific sequence. And here's what I come up with. Russ Briel, that would be me, by the way, was born in Paris, France. His dad was in the Navy. He moved back to Virginia, where he, meaning Dad, was stationed at the Pentagon. So now let's take out all the gaps in here. And I submitted this to an online randomizer, as if you took all those letters and just jumbled them up. And so this is what they sent back. So let me show you what we found. So I found 11 words in this random arrangement of these letters, which is equivalent to the random arrangement of amino acids. Set, rats, ran, or, as, is, and, we, it, by, his. Okay, 11 words. But do those words mean anything? Do they convey any information? None. Why? Because it's random. There's no intelligence behind it. And if you randomize them again, you're going to get the similar pattern. So how many times would we have to put these letters through a randomizer to eventually come up with this exact paragraph in the exact sequence of these letters? I'll tell you what, it's 1 in 10 to the 164th power. So despite the impossibility of proteins evolving from a standpoint of mathematical probability, it is still the dominant explanation of our existence. As they say, go figure. I kind of agree with Morpheus here, who said in the movie Matrix, what if I told you it's never going to happen? Chapter 4, Age of the Earth. So, what's the truth? 10,000 years old? 4 billion years old? Does anyone really know? So, did God use evolution? Now, some call this theistic evolution, which they assume that the evolutionists are right on the age of the earth, but they believe in God too. Therefore, God must have used evolution to bring forth his creation. And I say, well, I just wonder if that's just an easy compromise. You see, there's only one problem with this view, is that it injects God into a series of formulas that have excluded God from the equation in the first place. So I think this is a slippery slope. So how old is the earth? Well, it's 4.5 billion years according to radiometric dating, but the problem is that can vary by 1 billion years based on what section of the lava flow you measured. Maybe it's only 60 million years old based on the increasing salinity of the oceans. Maybe it's only 2 million years based on the depletion of helium in the atmosphere. You see, nobody really knows. Now, you have this whole group on your left of young Earth creationists, all the organizations and websites. On your right, there's a bunch of old Earth creation websites and organizations. Well, they both can't be right, So now I propose a different view. You see, no one knows how old the Earth is. You don't know. The evolutionist doesn't know, although he claims to. I don't know either. And guess what? I don't care. I'm with Garfield on this. The question is, I don't even think it matters. You see, I don't get hung up on this issue. You see, all I need to know is this, is that complexity, order, and design did not come about through something as pathetically inadequate as random chance and natural selection. You see, we don't have to know how old the Earth is to know that an incredible amount of intelligence is required, and an intelligence beyond our wildest comprehension. The real question is, when it comes to the age of the earth, is why do we only hear the one view that gives a maximum age, 4.5 billion years? We hear it all the time. It's like a constant drumbeat. I'll tell you why. Because evolution takes a long, and did I mention long? Long time. So in other words, time appears to be the same as magic. Because, here's a quote from Thomas Huxley. He was known as Darwin's bulldog. He said this, given enough time, monkeys typing on typewriters could type out the complete works of Shakespeare. Really? With plot, characters, theme, and dialogue? Really? It's obviously, it's patently absurd. Add 1 trillion years and millions of monkeys, and it's never going to happen. I kind of agree with this kid. Oh, really? The DNA molecule is far more complex than the works of Shakespeare. Lots of time does not mean random chance and natural selection will result in anything more than random change. You see, the evolutionist believes in magic. Now, here's a quote from George Wald. He received the Nobel Prize in medicine. This is what he said. Time is the hero of the plot. Given so much time, the impossible becomes possible. The possible becomes probable, and the probable becomes virtually certain. Really? All we need is time, and the impossible becomes virtually certain? Sounds like time is a magical ingredient. Now we enter the theater of the absurd. Now, remember this book? I remember Stephen Jay Gould. He wrote a book called, he wrote several books, but this book here is called A Wonderful Life. It was all about the Burgess Shale in Western Canada. This is where all those fossils were found that represent the Cambrian explosion. And so this was what I'm about to show you was a quote from a science writer for a national newspaper, and he was doing a review of the book. And so listen to what he says, and this represents the faith. This represents the faith of the evolutionist. One of the ways we have lived with Darwinism and the knowledge that the biblical story of creation is at best a metaphor is with the reassurance that nature, capital N, that nature herself embodied a godlike plan leading inevitably to ourselves. A plan? Sounds like intelligence to me. Oh, I get it. It's okay to believe that nature has a godlike plan, but you can't believe in God. It's a complete capitulation. He acknowledges that evolution without guidance, without a direction, without a plan, without a purpose doesn't work. But he's not willing to ascribe it to God, but only to nature. Excuse me, teacher, what class is this? So if there's a godlike plan, then maybe evolution is actually a religion. Is it? Well, according to Dr. Michael Roos, who teaches the philosophy of science at Florida State, it is. He says this: evolution is promoted by its practitioners as more than mere science. Evolution is promulgated as an ideology, a secular religion, a full-fledged alternative to Christianity. Evolution is a religion. Now, it's interesting. There's an enormous difference between the science of evolution and the philosophy of evolution. The amount of credible science supporting evolution is pretty minimal, whereas the philosophy permeates everything. Do species change over time? Yes, but only to a certain extent, within a certain range. That is a fact. Did man evolve randomly from bacteria? That is pure philosophy. There's a difference between the science of evolution and the philosophy of evolution. And now we have Richard Dawkins, and you all know who he is. I mean, he's this very aggressive atheist biologist. He's written a bunch of books. He lectures on college circuit all the time. He says this. Well, actually, Dawkins is a religious man. His religion is atheism. This is what he says. It is absolutely safe to say that if you meet somebody who claims not to believe in evolution, that person is either ignorant, stupid, or insane. I guess I must be one of those three. But you see, the science of evolution is collapsing. What remains is the philosophy or the religion of evolution. You see, when talking about evolution, the question is, where does the science end and the philosophy begin? Now, this quote is very instructive from Dawkins because the evolutionist often relies on mockery, ridicule, and personal attack to win the argument or simply to silence the opposition. They call it settled science to shut down any debate. There's nothing settled about it. Now, in honor of scientists, however, it's not my intent to denigrate anyone involved in the sciences. I love science. However, we must be able to fairly assess that which is observable and provable fact versus wishful thinking, conjecture, and wild assumptions. Now, astronomer Robert Jastrow with NASA was such a man. Unlike Dawkins, who is just a propagandist for atheism, he says this. I'm talking about Robert Jastrow now. He says, scientists have no proof that life was not the result of an act of creation, but they are driven by the nature of their profession to seek explanations for the origin of life that lie within the boundaries of natural law. And that's fine, as long as they can stay with the facts and not blend it with the philosophy. That's the problem. And Robert Jastrow, he wrote this book called The Enchanted Loom. He's got a great quote in this book. Now, again, he was an astronomer with NASA. He says this: for the scientist who has lived by his faith in the power of reason, the story ends like a bad dream. He has scaled the mountains of ignorance. He's about to conquer the highest peak. He pulls himself over the final rock. He's greeted by a band of theologians who have been sitting there for centuries. In conclusion, evolutionists accuse creationists of believing in fairy tales. Well, the grand plan of evolution is a fractured fairy tale of its own. a tale built on fake facts and just so stories. Here is the fairy tale of evolution. In the beginning, there was nothing, and nothing became everything all by itself. Thank you very much. Thank you for coming. Now, if you would like to invite me to your church or your youth group or your small group, if you live around here, I have 2 websites you can check out. Of course, you know about beholdthepencil.com, which is a kind of a crazy sound. But then there's also Creation Unveiled, and they both go to the same place. And this Poster Creative, actually, I can customize that for you to promote this at your church, youth group, or small group. And so, again, the name of this presentation has been Unmasking Evolution, what your biology textbook forgot to tell you. And again, thank you so much for coming.